All right, welcome to another episode of the Credder Podcast. I'm your host, Chase Palmieri, and with me today is Alastair Bostwick. Alastair is the lead creative producer and a journalist at Verizon Media. He's reported for Yahoo, Bloomberg, BuzzFeed News, and PBS, and he also hosts a popular YouTube channel called BostWiki, where he faces the camera and does deep dives into many different interesting stories, and some of which we're going to be covering here today. Alastair, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so I wanted to start with something kind of personal, which is you having your own YouTube channel while you're still working for these other traditional outlets. What is the importance of having your own branded channel in today's internet world?
Ooh, that's a nuanced question. I guess I should separate myself out slightly in that I have not always had the ability to have my own channel. Working in media in particular, often you get into non-compete clauses just because work tends to overlap with your employer. So when I was at BuzzFeed for many years, for instance, that was a no-go. So I wasn't able to produce any content. It wasn't until I was able to climb the hierarchical rank, so to speak, that I could kind of push back on negotiations to have that freedom. But I like it just so I have some sort of little territory of creative control where I can speak my views on things totally uninhibited.
Yeah, and it seems like an important way for journalists to leverage their audience base and actually be able to maybe in the future move your audience base with you to a different media outlet. One thing that we've seen a lot is these big name journalists were able to leave some of their outlets to go to things like Substack.
Yeah.
And if they have the audience, they can just bring them directly there with them. And that's kind of what I see as the importance of authors and journalists having their own brand and not just relying on a small byline with the outlet they work for. Would you agree that that's kind of the power that you get?
100%. And this is exactly why large media companies are so wary, particularly as video journalism has gotten bigger, and I use that in broad quotes, is that idea of when you're thinking on a company's perspective, you don't want to invest all this money into talent or building up a reporter for them to just suddenly leave and go on to Substack or what have you. And so there's a undercurrent of a battle between every reporter or person in media wanting to build their own brand and every company wanting to make sure they can't quite so they can retain that talent.
Yeah, I think it took a while before people, the media outlets were even listing journalists' Twitter handles on their kind of linked profiles, right?
Right. Yes.
Yeah. So how long have you been working on the YouTube channel?
Oh, I've been making videos for many years, but off and on. I enjoy just telling stories. And that's just led me down the path of media and then journalism. And as I worked at PBS or BuzzFeed and took kind of hiatuses from YouTube to work a kind of traditional job, I took breaks, sometimes years at a time. But now, more recently, in the past year, 2 years, I've been making content more consistently.
Cool. And one of the things I want to get into with you next is the recent BuzzFeed acquisition of Huffington Post, because there's a lot of moving pieces, a lot of kind of reshuffling of the media deck going on, especially in New York, where you're based out of.
Yeah.
But before we do get into that, can you explain what it means to be a lead creative producer at Verizon Media?
Yeah, it's a title that big companies make up because they don't really have a good term for what you do. It means I oversee a bunch of different teams and or do my own reporting. So in most modern digital media newsrooms, you have a social team that's responsible for creating thumbnails and headlines and publishing the content. Then you have a team that's responsible for producing often the video content that you'll see on a Washington Post or Yahoo Finance. It doesn't matter. Those kind of videos. And then you'll have your classic news desks, like reported news desks, and then you'll have your beats, your finance beat, your national desk. And I liaison between all of these. So I kind of just see, because I have a background in reporting, but I also have a background in video production and everything, hey, so-and-so's reporter is doing this story. Do you want to go with them to go film? Maybe we can turn this into a video. What are you working on? Maybe a reporter has this B-list of them on camera. It's this big catch-all term, but it allows, circling back to what we were talking about earlier, me to also, in the background, have my own YouTube channel and do the things I really want to do and take sometimes very contrarian viewpoints.
Right. Yeah, and we recently had on Andrea Brianna, who was one of the co-founders of Huffington Post, and we dove into that. That was breaking news at the time, which I think was maybe a month and a half ago when that happened. You did a video on your channel, BostWiki, about the importance of what's happening here. Just to give a little bit of background, because I want you to get into more of the nuance. BuzzFeed recently acquired Huffington Post from Verizon Media. The Huffington
Correct.
Post was, in some sense, a non-profitable entity for Verizon Media, and in the deal, Verizon Media was able to actually acquire a pretty significant stake of BuzzFeed as part of that deal. The benefit to BuzzFeed is that Verizon Media has such a huge distribution that BuzzFeed might be able to fill that content for the distribution. So it seems like a good partnership, kind of a natural consolidation, which we tend to see in media anyways. But what else do we need to know about the importance of this deal?
I think it's just a leading indicator of what's to come, which is you're going to see a lot more consolidation between the digital media companies that we're all super familiar with, whether that be Vice or Vox or BuzzFeed, Now This News, the ones that were very popular, let's say, in 2016. As the venture capital money has dried up, they're now coalescing to get bigger and make sure they can sustain themselves in the long term. The BuzzFeed one's important because BuzzFeed, of the top three, I'd say Vice, Fox, and BuzzFeed, and each have made various acquisitions. I think Vice bought Refinery 29.
Yeah.
And Vox bought New York Mag, and BuzzFeed, which is backed on the back end by Lair Hippo Ventures, which is a VC fund that also funds Now This News and the Dodo and all that stuff. But BuzzFeed wanted to IPO in around 2018. They missed their revenue margins. They had to back down from that. And as VC money has dried up and advertising dollars have just gotten more thin, you see kind of an M&A situation between Verizon Media that controls a lot of legacy platforms like Huffington Post, Yahoo Finance, AOL, that have often big ingrained audiences, but just sometimes aren't that great at finding a way to make them profitable. And BuzzFeed's pretty lean and profitable, but still has a much smaller demographic. BuzzFeed's demographic still 70% female, let's say, and female millennial, whereas Yahoo is still used by millions upon millions upon millions of Americans that are in their 40s, 50s, 60s or years old. It's still their homepage, they check their finances, and that just offers a window of a way bigger audience and the potential to maximize revenue ad dollars.
And why do you think that the venture capital money has been drying up? Is it just that at the start they thought, oh, these will be the next big CNN, Fox, and New York Times, and these are going to be hugely profitable businesses, and media entities like this are going to be important on the internet? But now we've realized that it's actually really hard in some cases to monetize these properties, and that Facebook and Google tend to get all the leverage in the situation?
Yeah, correct. Media companies have a really high burn rate in terms of they're very expensive to operate. And 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I think people were very optimistic about exactly what you're saying, that there's going to be a lot of advertising revenue. And what ended up happening is that Facebook and Google kind of ended up getting the lion's share of that. And that left a big shortfall between the burn rate that these media companies have to employ big newsrooms and big apparatuses to create content itself, rather than distribute it like Google or Facebook, and then the amount of profit they're actually making.
Yeah, this is something we talk about a lot on the program, is kind of the cost of creating journalism, because as it gets, well, it probably is getting cheaper over time as we have more and more of these services. Like you can go direct to YouTube and get a story out there, but it is expensive to have these people on staff. And I think that that's why we're seeing this push towards more and more opinions and hot takes and kind of commentary, because it's just cheaper than actually doing the investigative reporting. Would you agree with that?
100%. Yeah, entirely.
Okay. And another thing we talk about in regards to this is how venture capital tends to give kind of a multiplier to tech companies as opposed to purely content creating media companies. We had Hacker Noon's CEO, David Smook, on, and he's talking about how he's constantly trying to take what was originally just kind of a blog and turn it more and more into a tech company with more and more tech underlying capabilities. And that he does that to try to maximize the valuation and his potential to raise money going forward. I know BuzzFeed has a lot of technical abilities on their back end.
You're correct. That's a good piece of inside knowledge that I don't think a lot of people know. That
Can you explain how BuzzFeed is a little bit more advanced technically than some of the other, even just say HuffPost?
Yeah, I'll give you a really good example that BuzzFeed's was light years ahead in many media companies, and that they had built a back-end software for when a reporter was writing up an article or made a video, and they wanted to upload it natively onto their O&O, their owned and operated site. So onto BuzzFeed.com. I've written an article, and when I put it into the CMS, I'm going to then type in 3 different headlines and 3 different thumbnail images. And the back end CMS is going to ABC test those in real time within 45 minutes and see what the CTR rates are, all just algorithmically. And it's going to figure out what's the best thumbnail, what's the best headline, and then gear it towards whatever the audience. And it's taking place all in real time. And that was something BuzzFeed was doing 4 or 5 years ago that many media companies are still just kind of guessing, it's still fly by night. Oh, we think a curiosity gap headline is right for this, or we think this is the right thumbnail. But BuzzFeed had just built in all these hyper efficient CMS things that put them leagues ahead.
Yeah, and that's exactly like a tech company, to have that kind of iterative approach to even just what image and headline to use. And I think BuzzFeed would agree that was a big part of why they grew as quickly as they did.
Yes.
But now we're seeing big names such as Ezra Klein of Vox and Ben Smith of BuzzFeed, both the former editor-in-chiefs of those respective media entities. I won't say fleeing, because that's not necessarily fair, but getting gobbled up by the New York Times. And you're based in New York. You're deep into all of these different media properties. What is New York Times? Because as news consumers, I think we tend to have a very unnuanced perspective. It's just like, oh, they're the biggest name in news. They're one of the oldest and most respected names in news. But what are they on the business side of the media landscape?
They're just a giant at this point. They're so dominant. You'd have to fact check me on the exact number, but I think in the US they employ 1 out of every 4 or 5 journalists, really. Maybe that's between New York Times and Washington Post, but basically the New York Times dominates how many journalists they employ relative to every other just working reporter in the United States. And they're able to do that, 1, through prestige. 2, they have a huge audience. 3, they pay significantly more than any other media company. And they're able to do this and be aggressive about their hiring and their journalism practices because they've successfully, just as Vice and Vox and BuzzFeed were really innovative on the kind of tech side, and in terms of figuring out native advertising or programmatic advertising, do that in interesting ways. New York Times was able to really crack the code on getting digital subscriptions, and that digital subscription thing has offered them a war chest of just, they're super liquid. They have a ton of cash, and they can just go out there and start poaching the best reporters.
Yeah. And it makes a lot of sense for a big name brand like the New York Times to have really leaned into subscriptions. One thing that we kind of talk about on the show is how that's very convenient for a Washington Post or a New York Times, but that it's a lot harder for these smaller media properties to kind of follow the same revenue model, because news consumers aren't necessarily willing to be subscribed to more than 4 news publishers. So what do you think is going to happen to Vox and BuzzFeed now that they're losing two of the really big kind of forward-thinking innovators that led the company's growth?
I've been wrong so many times that I'm really bad at predicting the future, so I have no idea what will happen. But I think it's an indicator that digital media is definitely in the second act, right? We had that kind of exciting first act where it looked like a lot of these new media companies were shaking things up and journalism was going to be totally different, and everybody was wide-eyed and optimistic in 2015. And now in 2021, a lot of those dreams haven't been realized. And in the second act, there's a lot more strategic long-term thinking that's taking place rather than immediate tactical Q1, Q2 making money, but like, how do we position ourselves? Given, as you said, you can't compete toe-to-toe with the New York Times, which Ben Smith, when he was at BuzzFeed News back in the day, thought, maybe tongue in cheek, but yeah, we're going to take on the New York Times. We're going to crush them. This is the new thing. I think that reality's just set in that no. So given that space, how do the rest of these media companies carve out revenue models, journalism models? How do they do it? I don't know. I think part of the strategic guessing is with this kind of stock swap, cash injection between BuzzFeed and Verizon Media.
Yeah, just a lot of consolidation so that if everybody owns a little bit of everybody else, it's almost like they keep each other afloat, right?
Precisely. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
So another kind of interesting story that's playing out here is what's happening with Fox News, Newsmax, and OAN. It's almost like a right-wing media civil war happening here because Fox News was early to call, I believe it was Arizona for Joe Biden. Yeah.
Yep.
And a lot of the Trump supporters didn't like that. Perhaps it was a little early to call it, but they were kind of
right. They
ended up being right, correct. But but the Trump supporters felt, I guess, burned by that because they thought that their loyal Fox News was going to remain loyal to Trump, even while reporting what are kind of objective election results. And Newsmax and OAN seem to step up and try to use that as, an opportunity to really grow their brands and take from the Fox News audience. And I think to a certain extent it's worked. Fox News has lost a lot of ratings since the end of the Trump presidency. To be fair, all cable news has. And I think that, to be honest, this might be the end of cable news once and for all. I think Trump was so exciting that he kept cable news relevant for an extra 4 years, probably 4 years longer than it should have. And I think that what we're going to see is a lot of YouTube style channels, whether it's things like The Hills Rising or individual commentators kind of fill the cable news void. But OAN and Newsmax are trying to fill the right-wing media void. And we're seeing some interesting things happen. I don't know if you've been following this story, but Newsmax was originally reporting some of the kind of conspiracy theories around the Dominion voting machines, and then they actually were sued by Dominion. And since then, they've had to, like, whenever the topic comes up, they get very nervous and they like constantly have to state, we don't have any facts that prove this. And recently, there's even been hosts who walk off the program when a guest comes on and starts talking about it because they just don't want to be part of the lawsuit. And so it's weird. We've seen them go from Fox to Newsmax, and now Newsmax is being I guess the right-wing media audience is now upset at Newsmax because they're no longer making the claims that they were about the Dominion voting machines. And so now they're moving to OAN. What do you think is going to play out here? Do you think Fox has lost their hold on this audience forever, or that someday they're going to come back?
Ooh, again, nuance. I'd have to unravel it. I don't know if Fox lost something it never had. I mean, the kind of Trump devotee didn't really exist. It wasn't like, I don't think somebody that was really watching Fox News avidly anyway, nor in, let's say, pre-Trump era, nor do I think Fox News ultimately wants to cater to that audience. I think they were happy to have the audience while it lasted. But again, big cable news media companies look not just at the size of their audience, but let's say their economic status. And so Fox News is going to actually want to cater towards a more classical Republican George Bush anyway, because they're going to have a higher earning power, higher income, which translates to better ad buys on cable news. So yeah, they may have a smaller audience than they did in 2018 at the height of Trumpism, but if they're able to recapture maybe some of the kind of classic Republicans that were making lots of money, just mid-right ideology, it doesn't matter to Fox News.
Yeah, that's a good point, because ultimately it does come back to that advertising dollar.
Right. And the second part of that is, additionally, Fox News may see a loss in their audience, let's say right now from 2012. And that may be because, as you point out, with the rise of OAN and Newsmax, Fox News does finally have some competition for any viewpoint in the Overton window of thought to the right. Fox basically just dominated. If you look at it, a continuum, and on the right, so the camera would be my left hand, on the right side, it was just Fox News sitting there kind of editorializing. And the rest of cable news, the left, they had divvied up in little slices: MSNBC, CNN, NBC, ABC. So they were all competing for the left. Fox News was just enjoying its huge monopoly. And now they're having to compete with Newsmax and OAN and other upstart right-wing media companies. If you follow.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad you brought up the Overton window, because that is the perfect transition or segue into what I wanted to talk about with your video series that you did on NewsGuard, which, full disclosure, is Credder's direct competitor. So I'm going to try to be a little more removed from this discussion, but kind of like let you report on some of the things that you uncovered. But first, can you explain for listeners who maybe aren't as media savvy what the Overton window is?
So the Overton window is a phrase coined by, forget his first name, Joseph Overton or somebody. He was some professor in Michigan, University of Michigan or something. But he observed a phenomenon that is very important and exists in the abstract, which is that the Overton window is simply the realm of acceptable ideas that are allowed in society at any given generation. And, you can have acceptable right views and acceptable left views during the 50s or the 70s, or then during our era. And then anything outside of those acceptable views are considered radical on either way. And so Alex Jones should just push this aside, because he would be outside of the Overton window on the right. I'm not for Alex Jones whatsoever, but just using him as an example of outside the Overton window of acceptable ideas on mainstream thought. And that just shifts with time.
Yeah. And can you, not to put you on the spot here, but can you give an example in recent years of something that actually moved the Overton window in one direction or another?
Yeah, marijuana is a great one. I mean, if you think about the kind of collective ideas on weed legalization, I don't even smoke weed. I don't care at all. I have no dog in this fight, but just the way we no longer care collectively, societally, about marijuana legalization as they dominate with all the states, and the federal government doesn't even bother prosecuting anymore. I remember in the 90s, they just would have never flown. I mean, people advocating for marijuana legalization in the 90s were considered very fringe. They'd have a little group at the university campus out there with their signs, and they'd be next to the guy talking about how the world's going to end in 10 days. It was just outside the Overton window. Nobody took it seriously on NBC News or CNN. And now you have the governor of New York, Cuomo, tweeting about how, we're going to legalize marijuana. Yeah, it's going to bring a lot of tax dollars.
Yeah, I guess that's a great example. And the financial incentive definitely helps move that Overton window in that case.
Right. And I guess just to tag that, so to understand that abstractly, is that in the 1990s, the legalized marijuana would be like maybe a far left idea, and this kind of a fringe oh, those liberal hippies, they don't understand. And now in 2021, you have John Boehner, who is the former Speaker of the House, big Republican, who's on the board of the biggest marijuana stock company in the United States. I mean, it has no, it just shifted outside the Overton window. So it's not like a left-right thing per se, it's just the realm of acceptable ideas.
Yeah, perfect. That's a perfect explanation. So again, I need to be a little delicate here on how I turn this over to you and talk about NewsGuard. It's actually the first time I think that I've ever spoken publicly about NewsGuard. But I think that you pointed out some things that are potentially worrying or concerning to news consumers and to the space in general. Should NewsGuard become the dominant provider of news ratings?
Right.
Again, not to say that Credder needs to be the alternative, but I think NewsGuard and Credder believe that there is both a business incentive in this space, but also a real problem that needs solving, not just for news consumers, but for the platforms themselves who don't want to be responsible for determining what is or is not credible on their websites.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So it makes sense to outsource this responsibility to a NewsGuard or a Credder, but why don't you, maybe you can even start with some things that you like, if there are things you like about NewsGuard, and kind of give us some of the things that you reveal in that two-part series.
I'm cautious myself because I don't know if my inherent opinion on NewsGuard is more a projection of my personality, and that I'm very wary of authority writ large, and the idea that, precisely as you said, that platforms are wary about making a distinction between what is real news, what is not real news, they don't want to get into it for legal reasons, Section 230, it's a headache for them. But at the same time, they always get called out for promoting fake news by journalists. Facebook's promoting, they're stuck in a catch-22. And so there would be a market, one would conceptualize, like NewsGuard, to come in there as a third-party arbitrator and be like, we verified on the back end, this is a trustworthy article. This is not. This is a hoax. The problem is then who watches the watchers, right? It's the classic. Well, they only have one monopolistic third-party arbitrator. Who's on their back end deciding what is verified, what is legitimate, and what are their inherent biases, and that just ceding my attention. I'll talk about ceding my trust or my attention to some outside third party always makes me inherently wary, I guess. So that would be my just inherent suspicion about NewsGuard. But like I said, I couch that, and I don't know if that's more my personality, because I can definitely see there is a efficiency utility. If you're a casual consumer of news and you're not plugged into Twitter all the time, and you're not on YouTube all the time, like looking back and forth between what the heck Tim Pool is saying versus what the heck is the Rising Hill saying versus listening to, if you're not a big consumer and you just want to make sure you're not accidentally sharing a video that's been deep faked, okay, then perhaps NewsGuard could really just help you from blundering.
Yeah, I think you're right on the point there, which is that I think this is the same thing we see where sometimes a dictatorship is more effective. It's more efficient than a democracy, for example.
Yeah.
I think it's the same thing. NewsGuard is a bit of a kind of a central authority, and they do employ journalists, but again, these are journalists that they hire. Perhaps there's some kind of an inherent bias in the journalists that they decide to bring on. But what I think is perhaps interesting to get into with NewsGuard is that they slap these yellow, red, or green labels on outlets, on the outlet level. So they're not necessarily looking at individual pieces of content. They're not necessarily looking at
right, yes.
Yeah, so they're not necessarily looking at who's creating the content too, besides the outlet level. And I think that when you look at just some of the ratings that they have, so CNN, green light, okay, is that really nuanced enough to provide any real thought? And one of the things that you get into is that although it is useful to the casual news consumer to kind of quickly, maybe at least be warned that a website is potentially flagged as
Right.
unreliable. There's value in that. But you also believe, as I do, that there's value in news consumers not outsourcing their critical thinking skills. One thing that you do a lot of on your channel is promoting media training and media literacy. So can you talk about kind of the importance of us as news consumers to still have a role to play in this?
Yeah, I mean, immediately it's just the idea that media companies aren't static. So even if we green light, I should say you and I are behind, our Leviathan power here to green light CNN is trustworthy. CNN is still moving forward in time, and they can change its board, change its reporters. Things can happen. I think CNN, the reporters I know at CNN, would willingly admit they have moved to the left since the Trump era. And that, however you feel about it, it just means that media organizations aren't static, and therefore, even if we say this media organization is reliable, it doesn't always mean they will be in the future, and vice versa. Breitbart could theoretically become a much more legitimate news organization. BuzzFeed has made serious attempts to make its news arm, BuzzFeed News, much more legitimate. And in fact, often BuzzFeed News is pretty precise, even though it gets lost in the branding of BuzzFeed versus BuzzFeed News.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. Another thing about NewsGuard is, and I'll let you do some of the reporting here, is some troubling characters on their board of directors.
Oh my gosh! See, I should have brushed up on what I said. It's bad. I've forgotten who's on their board of directors, Chase.
I mean, it's kind of a who's who of former government officials, some CIA
Oh,
officials.
that's right. Yeah, I mean, to my mind, recalling when I kind of did a deep dive into NewsGuard, is what it reminded me of again was the revolving door of a parallel revolving door of lobbyist and DC elite insider. You work at Congress, then you get a nice cushy job, and then you read the legislation, and it helps out your buddy who just got elected to Congress. And it's this kind of just circular beltway system within DC, which is very similar in news. That okay, we'll hire reporters because I know you, and you used to work at CNN, and we're all buddy buddy. And the CIA because I used you as a source all the time, and we'll put you on because we know we can trust the CIA or the FBI. I don't know. The media has always had a cozy relationship sometimes with government sources that sometimes aren't always acting in the best faith of the reader.
Yeah. Okay. And this might be the last thing I'll say on NewsGuard, because I think neither of us necessarily enjoy talking about them. The one advantage that NewsGuard has against what we're doing at Credder is that when you're only rating the outlet and not the author and article level, it's much more efficient. You can pretty much just direct your 20 journalists to review the outlet, go through their through some of their articles, maybe their about page, how they do their reporting, how they do their corrections, that kind of thing, and you can give them a rating. Now, again, no news consumers were able to participate in that rating, but it's very quickly they could get a rating up for an outlet. Whereas what we're trying to do is much more difficult because we're trying to get ratings on the article level, which means that we have to compete with the timeliness of news. And so there are things we do to bubble up an article review to cover the author and outlet into creating those overall scores. But it's much more difficult to do what we're trying to do. And I think that's why NewsGuard is doing so well in the space, is because they have this kind of head start and this advantage. But I do think that in the long term, more people like you, more reporters are going to start diving into, okay, but what really is NewsGuard? And how come I, as a news consumer, aren't able to participate in these ratings? And I think that's problematic in the long term.
Yeah, I think NewsGuard has a lot of inherent problems in it. I would not personally recommend using NewsGuard. Precisely as you're saying, there's a perverse incentive between, let's say, NewsGuard and media institutions, in the sense that in order for NewsGuard to get adopted quickly, they need big media institutions to utilize it. So we'll take CNN, for instance. Well, hey, we'll fast track you for green light. Yeah, you pump out a zillion pieces of reporting a day. Nigh very, very difficult to go through and be like, well, what reporters in the news desk are actually good at CNN, which ones aren't, which ones have to make retractions all the time. And we're going to fast track you, CNN. One, because we've just hired 5 of your former employees, and one of you guys sits on our board. We're all good. And then, hey, do you mind, kind of promoting NewsGuard, putting it as top of your thing, CNN. So there's a kind of a weird perverse incentive for CNN to benefit from NewsGuard and NewsGuard to benefit from CNN without actually looking at any of the underlying content in a meaningful way and being like, this reporter at CNN is really good. These 2 reporters at CNN are awful. They get things wrong all the time. You're not going to see that with NewsGuard in any meaningful way. One, because they just don't do it, and 2, there's an incentive to not look at it that way.
Yeah, and we're talking about also how these platforms are facing this issue. We see more and more that context is kind of the preferred solution here. They like to add a context label, some kind of a warning label, some little additional piece of information. I think that, yeah, there's a lot of censorship happening for sure, but I think that it's becoming more and more industry standard to try to add a layer of context to the content rather than have to pull it down. I'm wondering just what if you think that Facebook employing, for example, and this hasn't happened yet, but if Facebook were trying to solve the problem, do you think that it would be satisfactory to them to outsource the need to NewsGuard? Or do you think that these platforms will themselves be like, well, I feel like our users, we're a social platform, we're kind of a decentralized, give people a voice type of platform. Whatever solution we employ for the ratings should reflect that.
I don't know, honestly. It's kind of choose your poison, because when you just seed it to the users, you get all kinds of inherent biases. Again, let's take YouTube, for example. You can have kind of mass flags or campaigns to take down certain things simply because you dislike the ideology, you dislike the person, or you just want to harm them in some way or harm that Facebook group. You just kind of mass flag it, and the platform doesn't know what to do, so it's just responding to whatever the user inputs are. That's a recipe for trouble. And equally, there's a recipe for trouble by just outsourcing it to a dominant third-party arbitrator that has its own incentives to get stuck in the Overton window. I'll give you an example. We can just go out on a limb here and say, if you had written an article, I had written an article at this time last year, and I said, everybody go out and wear surgical masks. They help prevent COVID-19. I'd get flagged for misinformation. Oh, the WHO has said, do not wear surgical masks, only for 2 months, later, let's say March or April of 2020. Totally reversed, in which case I would have been right all along, but I would have been flagged as misinformation. Same with, where again, these things aren't static. The coronavirus, COVID-19, possibly could have come from a lab, Wuhan lab. There's a lot of correlatory factors. Again, oh no, we got to trace it back to the bat or the pangolin or whatever it is. And you're going to get flagged as misinformation until, as we're starting to see a year later, as that Overton window switches, oh, maybe we should re-examine the hypothesis that perhaps accidentally, not through malicious intent, that this did escape from a tier 4 lab in Wuhan, China.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I'm going to add another example to that, because you're exactly right. There needs to be some flexibility or iteration in the system, because the Overton window, if a rating is determined within that Overton window, we know that it's constantly moving. And so you have to be able to at least update it or adjust. Another example could be the march into war when we were discussing weapons of mass destruction, right? Like those outlets that were talking about these weapons of mass destructions as objective truth, probably
New York Times, Judith Miller. I mean, they're culpable at the highest levels.
Right.
Sorry.
And yeah, no, exactly. And imagine what the ratings would have been for the publishers who were taking what was perceived as an unpatriotic stance at the time,
Right.
and probably checking that and saying, no, actually, we don't have any proof. No, we shouldn't just rush into war. So I
Right.
think
Precisely.
that's another great example of the kind of danger of that model. But anyway, thank you for touching on that with me. Let's move on. One thing that I wanted to dive into, I don't think that this is affecting many people yet, but I think it's going to become a bigger and bigger issue, is kind of the story of Lauren Kwai, which you covered as part of one of your segments. You talk about how sometimes the mainstream media will take somebody who did not ask to be in the public limelight and is not representing themselves as a public figure, but
Right.
that they can quickly become made a public figure just because some media outlet wants to run a story for that 24-hour news cycle, which could, in some cases, and possibly in the case of Lauren, destroy that person's lives and that life and reputation for the rest of their lives, because it was a quick, interesting kind of little clickbaity story. And the person who didn't ask to be in the limelight doesn't really have much recourse. And you specifically dive into this issue of how it relates to when the court of public opinion versus the actual legal courts, and how when you go after rich people in the legal courts, they can hire the best representation, the best defense attorneys,
Right.
and the people who don't have money to represent themselves in the legal courts end up getting they're just victims of the crushing, grinding system. And what I had never thought about was how the same thing relates to the court of public opinion, where companies or individuals, wealthy individuals who are under attack by media, can defend themselves through PR campaigns or other things like that. Whereas an individual, like in the case of Lauren Kwai, who I'll let you explain what happened, she doesn't have the money or the team to help get her narrative or her side of the story out to defend herself. So I'd love to hear you kind of explain that in more detail for our listeners.
Right. So, I mean, just as a little portrait background, Lauren was an EMT nurse in New York City. She didn't really make enough money doing that during COVID-19 of all things, because we just don't pay EMTs enough in New York City. It turns out, pay them $20 an hour or whatever it was. And so she started an OnlyFans account, which is
can you explain what an OnlyFans account?
Yeah. So an OnlyFans account, OnlyFans is a website for people to, what would be an articulate way of saying it? For individuals to monetize their sexuality without having to pay any sort of third party, they don't have to go into the adult industry and sign some contract, but they can just capitalize on their sexuality. So if they want to take nude photos and send them to their subscribers for an amount of money, that's what OnlyFans allows. So that's what she started an OnlyFans account to raise money, to make money, I should say. And she was doing it on the side, like a side gig, because being an EMT didn't pay enough money for her to afford her apartment in New York City. The kind of sad realities of life. The New York Post found out about the EMT in New York City that also has an OnlyFans, which is a kind of lascivious, salacious concept title, and they just kind of exposed her. Now, never mind that she's essentially just a private young 20-year-old girl who minding her own business. Now she's spread on the front page of the New York Post and all over the internet, and they quasi-doxed her by exposing all her social media accounts, calling up her employer, just kind of ruining her life for all intents and purposes. And we get into a really gray area in 2021, which is what is a public and a private figure. In 1950 or 1990 even, it was really kind of easy to determine pre-internet who a private individual was and who a public figure was. And when you're a private individual, you have a right to privacy. Media companies can't really just throw you onto the front page. At least they couldn't, unless you were deliberately doing things to put yourself in that limelight. And that sharp yellow line has become intensely gray now, with everybody having a presence on the internet, whether through their own individual Instagrams to Facebooks to OnlyFans accounts. And New York Post can now make an argument, which they would do in court if, let's say, Lauren was very wealthy. How it would play out in court, because I work in media and know everybody, is that if Lauren was the daughter of a billionaire, the billionaire would sue the New York Post immediately for invasion of privacy. And the New York Post would argue, well, she has an OnlyFans account. She is a public persona. She is selling her image and her likeness to blah, blah, blah. We have a right to cover it. And her billionaire family would argue, no, this doesn't actually, and the courts would suddenly have to be forced to decide, well, okay, in the modern era, what is private, what is public? Because we haven't really returned to that issue since many, many decades ago. And to illustrate this even better, when I was at BuzzFeed, there was a trick we would do, which is when we were turning out daily content, for instance, and we wanted to cover a cool new jetpack that had just been designed in Silicon Valley and was flying out over the bay in San Francisco or something. And there was this cool video, but we didn't have the rights to it. We couldn't show it without licensing the company that had made this jetpack and was showing it in their promotional video. Well, we didn't have the rights to it, but we wanted to show it. We wanted to capitalize on the audience. We could circumnavigate those rules, those licensing agreements, by digging up a bunch of tweets that were talking about the jetpack. And then we can make an argument that, well, actually, our story is not about the jetpack. It's about people talking about the jetpack. And because our story is now people talking about this cool new jetpack, we can then insert the image or the video of the jetpack into our story and bypass. Because, oh, no, we're not actually talking about the jetpack. We're talking about the people who are talking about the jetpack. And we show a bunch of tweets to make it plausible. And these are the same weird twists and turns that have now become a deeply gray area within media. I'm digressing a heavy amount, so feel free to rein me back in. I don't know.
No, I think that's right on. I want to get into actually tweets as part of articles. First, let's talk a little bit more about Lauren and this situation.
Yeah.
I think that this is going to become more and more normalized. These media outlets going after individuals, because I think that like you said, these media outlets, there's a lot of more wiggle room than there used to be, and I think that the wiggle room is, as you mentioned, almost everybody has a Facebook profile or a Twitter account these days. Does that make you a public profile, a public individual because you have a public page? Is that not the definition of being a public person? No. Is it that you have to have 1 million followers to be a public person? Like what is the line? Because anybody and everybody could be, if they interact online, could be argued that they are a public figure because they're interacting in the public arena of the internet. And I think that what we see with the kind of the increase in sensationalism and clickbait stories and kind of some of these nastier stories that you know are going to get clicks, but you also know are going to create kind of this collateral damage for the individual's lives, all for that one quick turnaround of the 24-hour news cycle. I think that we're going to see this more and more. I don't know how it's going to play out, but I do think that we need to create some kind of a way of distinguishing between a public person on the internet and a still private person on the internet. I don't know how we do that, but I think that cases like Lauren Kwai are the canary in the coal mine, and that we're going to see a lot more of this going forward. Any last thoughts on that?
No, I 100% agree with you, and I think it's circling back to what you were saying earlier, why I feel personally that media training is important, and I wish we had a broader discussions in our society about just rudimentary understanding of the media ecosystem, and just as we have rudimentary understandings of how to interact with the police. And if you call in question, probably don't talk to them. Get a lawyer. There's certain things that we kind of condition into ourselves in order to have a quasi defense in case you happen to get caught up in the system. And many innocent people get caught up in our criminal justice system. It's just a fact of life. Anybody who thinks that every single person that ends up in court is guilty or there for legitimate reasons has not lived a long enough life to realize, no. the system just gobbles up innocent and guilty people alike, and then it's played out, and whether that person has resources to defend themselves often in terms of being able to escape that system or not. And the same is true for media. It's a very powerful system that will just rip through individuals if they're not somewhat cognizant of what's headed their way, how they should engage with it or not engage with it, and what they should be careful about. Particularly, I think, as you said, Lauren is a canary in the coal mine, and more individuals that day to day don't think about the media impacting their immediate life, just like they don't think about the criminal justice system impacting their daily life until they suddenly get pulled over and then they say something wrong to the cop and the cop arrests them, and one day you find yourself on the cover of the New York Post for doing something that you thought was just a side gig, and now your family and friends know about whatever you're doing, your employer's berating you in public. It's just a tragedy.
Yeah, it's also worth noting that everything she did was completely legal.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. It's not. It was a story picked up as exactly as you said, because it makes for an interesting headline and for a kind of salacious 5-minute read. Oh, look at the EMT nurse who's selling nudes. Oh, what do you think about that? And then people move on and forget about it, except for the subject of the story whose life is now ruined.
Right. And one thing that you touched on there is the idea that when you get pulled over by a police officer, we've seen enough TV shows and movies that we know you have the right to remain silent. And, you've seen enough TV shows and movies to know that you should probably not talk to the police and get your lawyer and get that call to your lawyer in first things first. But in this story, you also touch on how the media kind of tricked Lauren into commenting on the story, which I guess in some ways gave the New York Post the right to run the story, gave them the go-ahead. Can you explain what happened there? And also as kind of a lesson for individuals who maybe get approached in the future by a media outlet, should they respond to the story? Do they have a right to not respond? What is in their best interest?
Right. Okay. So I'm going to do what all lawyers do when they're asked these questions, when they're like, I am not giving legal advice. This is just broad statements. Like, every situation is unique. In Lauren's case, reporters sometimes need an opening in which they can get control of the story. So if they can't get Lauren to confirm that it really is her OnlyFans account and she really is an EMT, then they don't really actually have a story, because without that, it's hard to get that. So if they call up Lauren and they seem amiable, hey, we want to run, we think you're doing something really powerful, it doesn't really matter. They can sell her either the story of like, we're going to cover it in a positive light and actually they throw her under the bus, or you can call up and you can kind of just lie through your teeth and be like, we're going to run this story regardless. Now, they may not, but you better answer our questions, otherwise, blah, 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 blah. No different than if you get pulled into a little police interrogation room and they say, we already know you've committed the crime, just confess. Whether they actually have any evidence or not, the police can lie to you straight to your face and just keep you in a room and try to get you to say whatever they want. Similar with journalists. We can, our goal is to position ourselves where often our subject thinks they need us to tell their story, and that we are going to tell their story better than they can. Right.
Cool. Well, I have a couple questions that I ask every guest at the end of every podcast. They're way off topic, but before we get there, why don't you give listeners a few places they should go to follow your work?
Oh, you can just go to YouTube, youtube.com/BostWiki, BostWiki. Just Google BostWiki. Watch my YouTube videos. Follow me on Instagram, Twitter, same thing, BostWiki, BostWiki.
Okay, great. All right, last two questions for you here. First question is Bitcoin. Are you a believer or not so much?
That's a good question. So let me answer your question with another question. What does believer mean? Define.
That's a great question. Yeah, I try to leave it vague and let people just kind of say what they want about Bitcoin usually. But I guess I would say Do you think it has value? Like if I gave you 10 Bitcoin, would you be happy about that?
Well, yeah, at the current, rate, sure. I mean, it's interesting because I've thought about Bitcoin for many, many years. And in 2012, I thought this was when Bitcoin was worth 6 cents, per Bitcoin. It was worth nothing. In my mind, there was two ways Bitcoin could go. It could go into a commodity, which is a store of value, similar to gold or silver, or it could turn into a currency, which acts as a means to facilitate the exchange of goods and services. And I thought Bitcoin would move into the currency shape. It would act like a currency, which means it would facilitate the exchange of goods and services. But in order for that to work, its value has to remain relatively low so people continue to use it. I didn't think it would turn into a commodity, but it did. It pivoted towards a commodity, which meant it's a store of value. So people see value in their ability, they can store money into it, I guess, as a hedge against inflation, or the government can't claw it back. But yeah. I mean, I'm a believer in the rise of cryptocurrencies, and that they are here and will inevitably move forward, replacing kind of fiat currencies. What that will look like, I don't know, and whether that will be Bitcoin, I don't know. But
Okay, so you're at least willing to say that the genie is out of the bottle and there's probably no going back.
Oh, 100%, yes.
Okay, and last question for you here, even more off topic, is Are we living in a simulation?
Again, one ponders it. I kind of feel like Elon Musk on this subject when he thinks about, if we are a simulation, what's the percentage that we're base reality, right? Like if we've already advanced to the purpose that we can build a simulation, then we would already be in a simulation. I don't know. I don't have a good answer. I have no empirical way to determine whether I'm in a simulation or not. My default says no, I think, but that's just my own human biological programming and dislike of the idea to believe I'm in a simulation.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Okay. Fair enough. You'd be surprised. So I asked those two questions to every guest that comes on the podcast. You'd be surprised how every single guest has thought about that issue. When I first thought, oh, okay, this will be a fun way to get people off their talking points and kind of end on something lighter, I expected a lot of people to be like, what's simulation theory or what, but everybody I've ever asked, even in media and journalism, thinks about this.
Interesting. Can I follow up then? Is the more common response yes, we're in a simulation, or no, we're not?
It's about 50-50. I'm actually thinking about creating like a kind of a slide or a video where it's just every guest and their answer to that one question. I might do that soon, but it's about 50-50. But I think about half the people who say yes, they're in a simulation, I think they just want to say that they're in a simulation because then they say something along the lines of, well, if you look at what's happened with Trump this last 4 years, and who would have thought Trump is a president, and blah, 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 and the world's so crazy. And therefore, yes, we must be in a simulation because none of this makes sense. So that's kind of like,
I don't know that by that. I don't know that by that.
It's not really the argument. It's more just like they want to outsource the problems of our society to the simulators.
They want to outsource the inherent chaos of our existence.
Yes, exactly.
Some unexplainable phenomenon. Fair enough.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks again for coming on, Alastair. I'm sure we'll want to have you on again in the future. This was how I want the podcast to be, kind of that casual, cool conversation. I hope everybody goes and follows your YouTube channel at BostWiki. I've been watching the videos. For listeners, there's some fun ones like on Woody Allen, for example, like how much of the allegations against him are true. Should you be able to watch his movies guilt-free? That one I highly recommend. And again, thanks for coming on, and best of luck to you in 2021.
Yeah, thank you. You too. It's great talking to you.